Most unsolved murders are frustrating for the same reason. Someone dies, the investigation stalls, and families are left without answers. And eventually the case fades into the background while everyone else moves on. But every once in a while, investigators encounter a case so bizarre that solving the crime almost becomes secondary to understanding what actually happened. Because before you can identify a killer, you first have to figure out what kind of reality would even allow a scene like this to exist. On August 20th, 1966, an 18-year-old boy named Giorgio da Costa Alves was flying a kite on Vintum Hill near Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. It was a warm Saturday afternoon. The hill overlooked the city and was a popular spot for kids to play, especially when the weather was good. At some point, while climbing higher on the slope, Giorgio noticed something strange lying in the grass ahead of him. At first, he thought someone was sleeping. Then he got closer, and he realized he was looking at two dead bodies. The men were lying side by side on the hill. Both wore formal suits, and both wore identical raincoats. Their bodies were positioned almost peacefully, as though they had simply laid down to rest and never gotten back up. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no visible injuries, and next to the bodies were two strange metal masks. Not full masks, more like oversized sunglasses made from solid lead. The scene was so bizarre that Giorgio immediately ran downhill in panic and alerted the authorities. By the time the police arrived, the situation had already become more complicated, because almost nothing about the deaths made sense. And over the following weeks, the investigation would spiral into one of the strangest unsolved mysteries in Brazilian history. A case involving secret occult groups, experimental electronics, coded instructions, mysterious pills, and possible UFO sightings, and two men who may have believed they were trying to contact spirits from another world. By the time investigators had reached Vintum Hill the next morning, the area was already crowded with reporters. News of the strange deaths had spread quickly throughout Rio de Janeiro. Photographers documented the scene before the bodies were removed, and those photographs would later become some of the most unsettling images associated with any unsolved case of the 1960s. Because the bodies didn't look like murder victims. They looked staged, deliberately positioned, almost ceremonial. The victims were identified quickly: 32-year-old Manuel Pereira de Cruz and 34-year-old Miguel Jose Viana. Both men worked as electronics technicians in a town roughly 175 miles north of Rio de Janeiro. According to family and friends, Manuel and Miguel were respected members of their community. Both were married, both held steady jobs, neither had any known enemies. Nothing in their personal histories suggested criminal activity or dangerous behavior, at least not at first. According to their families, the two men had left town together on the morning of August 17th, 3 days before their bodies were discovered. They claimed they were traveling to Sao Paulo to purchase electronic equipment and possibly buy a used car they had been looking at. But before leaving, they withdrew a fairly large amount of money, somewhere between 2 and 3 million cruzeiros. The exact modern equivalent is difficult to calculate because of inflation and currency changes, but it amounted to several $1,000s in today's money. Enough to matter. Enough that investigators immediately took notice when most of it vanished. At around 9 o'clock that morning, Miguel and Manuel were dropped off at a local bus station by a friend named Elcio Gomez. Elcio later told the police that he offered to walk inside and wait with them until the bus arrived, but the two men acted strangely. They insisted he stay outside. According to Elcio, they seemed nervous, distracted, eager to get moving. At the same time, he didn't think much of it. He watched them disappear into the station and drove away. It was the last confirmed time he saw either man alive. At first, police assumed they were investigating either a robbery or accidental poisoning, but the deeper they dug into the timeline, the stranger everything became. Because almost immediately, investigators discovered that the men had lied about where they were going. They never traveled to Sao Paulo at all. Instead, they boarded a bus to Niterói, a city just across the bay from Rio de Janeiro. A completely different destination, a completely different direction. Which raised an immediate question. If they lied to their families about where they were going, what were they actually doing in Niterói? Investigators began retracing the men's movements after arriving in the city. According to witnesses, Miguel and Manuel reached Niterói sometime around 2:30 in the afternoon. Their first stop was an electronics store. This detail initially seemed important because both men worked in electronics repair, and they had supposedly traveled to purchase equipment. But when police interviewed store employees, they uncovered another strange detail. Miguel and Manuel never bought anything. In fact, they barely spoke to anyone at all. They entered the store, looked around briefly, and left without even asking the clerk about products or prices, which made the entire visit feel pointless. Then it started raining. The two men ducked into a nearby clothing shop and purchased matching raincoats. Again, normal enough on the surface, but according to the store clerk, the men behaved oddly there too. They appeared anxious and distracted, and after buying the raincoats, they rushed out of the store without even putting them on despite the weather. That detail stuck with the clerk because it made no sense. Why urgently buy rain protection and then immediately run back out into the rain without using it? At this point in the investigation, police still assumed there had to be some rational explanation tying all these details together. Maybe the men were meeting someone, maybe they were involved in a business deal, maybe the electronics story was partially true, but the timeline only became stranger from there. The next confirmed sighting of Miguel and Manuel came from a local bar in the same neighborhood, and according to the bartender, the men seemed extremely concerned about the time. Miguel repeatedly glanced at the clock while ordering a bottle of mineral water. He appeared impatient, nervous, like he was waiting for someone or trying not to miss something. Then another small, important detail emerged. After paying for the water, Miguel carefully kept the receipt. This may sound insignificant, but in Brazil at the time, empty glass bottles could be returned for a deposit refund, meaning Miguel apparently expected to come back soon enough to return the bottle before heading home. Nothing about his behavior suggested someone preparing for suicide or expecting to disappear forever. If anything, it suggested routine, normality, as though whatever meeting or task they had planned was supposed to be temporary. No one knows what happened after they left the bar. No witnesses saw where they went next. But around 5 p.m., a local resident spotted two men arriving near the base of Vintam Hill. They were not alone. According to the witness, Miguel and Manuel exited a jeep driven by a blonde-haired man. There were at least 2 additional passengers inside the vehicle, though the witness couldn't identify them clearly. The jeep quickly departed after dropping the men off. Those unidentified individuals were never located, and whoever they were, they may have been the last people to see Miguel and Manuel alive. By now, investigators had assembled most of the men's movements leading up to their death, but they still had absolutely no idea what happened on the hill itself. And when they returned to examine the physical evidence more closely, the case took another sharp turn into the bizarre. The first thing investigators noticed was an absence of violence. There were no bullet wounds, no stab wounds, no bruising, no sign of a struggle, nothing. The men appeared to have simply collapsed where they lay. That alone was unusual enough, but the autopsy results made the mystery even worse, because the coroner found no internal injuries either, no trauma, no obvious cause of death. Unfortunately, decomposition complicated examination. The bodies had been exposed to the elements for several days before discovery, which meant toxicology testing was severely limited by the standards of 1966. If poison or drugs played a role, investigators were unable to conclusively identify them. And because of that, one of the most important questions in the entire case would remain unanswered forever. What exactly did Manuel and Miguel consume before they died? Then there was the issue of money. The men had left home carrying several million cruzeiros, but when police searched the bodies, only a small fraction remained. Most of the cash had disappeared. Naturally, robbery became an immediate theory, but that explanation didn't fit clearly either. Because if someone robbed the men, why leave anything behind at all? And why stage the bodies in such a bizarre way? Even stranger, despite lying exposed outdoors for days, the bodies showed almost no sign of animal interference, no scavenger damage. Whether that detail meant anything or not is impossible to know, but it contributed heavily to the eerie atmosphere surrounding the case. Even seasoned investigators reportedly found the scene unsettling. Then the police found handwritten notes, and suddenly the case transformed from strange to almost incomprehensible. 3 pages of handwritten instructions and calculations were found among the men's belongings. The first page appeared relatively harmless. It contained electronics notes, algebraic calculations, and references to Ohm's law, the formula used to calculate electrical current. Since both men worked as electronics technicians, investigators heavily dismissed it as ordinary work material. The second page was stranger. Translated from Portuguese, it read, "Sunday, 1 tablet after meal. Monday, 1 tablet in morning, on empty stomach. Tuesday, 1 tablet after meal. Wednesday, 1 tablet before bedtime." The note appeared to describe some sort of medication schedule, but according to friends and family, neither man suffered from any known illness. And if the Wednesday before bedtime does refer to the night they died, what exactly were they taking? No pills were recovered at the scene, and because toxicology results proved inconclusive, investigators had no way of determining what substances may have been in their system. But the third note became the most famous piece of evidence in the entire case, because it read like instructions for some kind of ritual. The translated text stated, 16:30, be at the determined location. 18:30, swallow capsules after effect, protect metals, wait for mask signal. Even in Portuguese, the wording was confusing, almost fragmented, as though someone may have quickly written down verbal instructions from another person. But despite the strange phrasing, several details became immediately clear. Miguel and Manuel had gone to Vintam Hill intentionally. They expected to take capsules of some kind, and the lead masks served a purpose. They were waiting for some kind of signal. The obvious question was, a signal from who, or what? Then there were the masks themselves, the detail that transformed the investigation into international news. The masks were handmade from sheets of lead, roughly cut, crude in appearance, and shaped vaguely like protective eyewear, but completely solid, impossible to see through, which made them simultaneously fascinating and useless. Lead is commonly associated with radiation shielding. Protective goggles and industrial equipment sometimes use leaded glass to reduce exposure to harmful energy or bright light. But these masks provided no visibility whatsoever. If worn properly, the men would have been completely blind, which forced investigators into an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe the masks weren't meant for practical protection at all. Maybe they were symbolic, or part of something ritualistic. Then investigators uncovered a chilling coincidence. 4 years earlier, another electronics technician had reportedly been found dead under strangely similar circumstances, and according to old reports, the man had also possessed a lead mask. In that earlier case, authorities concluded that the victim had become obsessed with paranormal theories involving radio frequencies and psychic communication. He reportedly believed that certain drugs would allow him to mentally receive signals from beyond normal human perception. One case could be dismissed as delusion, but now there were 3 dead electronics technicians connected by bizarre masks and strange beliefs. And suddenly, investigators realized they might not be dealing with an isolated incident at all. The deeper police dug into the lives of Manuel and Miguel, the more clear it became that the 2 men had been involved in something far stranger than a simple business trip. Because by the second week of the investigation, investigators weren't just chasing a murder anymore. They were trying to understand an entire subculture that most outsiders barely knew existed. A world where electronics technicians experimented with psychic communication, where radio frequencies and spirituality overlapped, and where groups of otherwise ordinary people genuinely believed that science and the supernatural can be combined into something measurable. One of the first major breakthroughs came from an unexpected source, Miguel's niece. Investigators learned that on the morning Miguel and Manuel left town, they had unexpectedly encountered her while waiting at a bus station. At first, Miguel repeated the same story he had told everyone else. He claimed they were traveling to buy a car and electronic equipment. But according to the niece, the explanation sounded suspicious immediately. The trip made no practical sense. Why travel hundreds of miles for something they could likely purchase much closer to home? Eventually, Miguel admitted there was another reason for the journey, a secret reason, but he refused to explain further. Instead, he told her something deeply strange. When he returned, he promised, he would tell her whether he truly believed in spiritism. That statement changed the entire direction of the investigation, because suddenly the strange notes, the lead masks, the unexplained behavior started pointing towards something much larger. Not a robbery, not a random murder, but some kind of spiritual or occult experimentation. To understand why that mattered so much in Brazil during the 1960s, you have to understand spiritism itself. In many parts of the world, spiritism is treated as fringe mysticism. In Brazil, it became something much bigger. By the mid-20th century, millions of Brazilians followed some sort of spiritist belief, and unlike stereotypical occult movements, spiritism often presented itself as rational, scientific, structured. Its followers didn't necessarily see themselves as mystics or cultists. Many genuinely believed they were studying hidden natural laws that mainstream science simply hadn't discovered yet. The movement began in the 1800s with a French educator and writer named Allan Kardec. Kardec became fascinated by seances and reports of communication with the dead. But unlike many spiritualists of the era, he attempted to organize these experiences systematically. Rather than relying purely on faith, Kardec approached the supernatural almost like a researcher. He compiled testimonies from the mediums across Europe and searched for recurring patterns between their accounts. Eventually, he published those findings in a text called the Spirits Book, which became one of the foundational works of Spiritist philosophy. The core belief centered around the idea that human consciousness survives death, that spirits continue existing in another realm, and most importantly, that communication between worlds might actually be possible under the right conditions. For many Spiritists, this wasn't magic, it was undiscovered science. And that distinction becomes critically important in the lead masks case. Because Miguel and Manuel weren't random occultists performing ceremonies in candlelight. They were electronics technicians, men with technical training, men deeply interested in radio frequencies, electrical systems, and communication technology. And according to the investigators, that combination may have pushed them towards increasingly dangerous experiments. Police searching Miguel's home eventually uncovered books relating to scientific spiritism. At first, that alone didn't seem particularly unusual given Brazil's religious landscape. But then investigators noticed several highlighted passages discussing luminous spirits, energy emissions, altered states of consciousness, and protective masks used during spiritual encounters. Suddenly, the lead masks at the death scene no longer looked random, they looked intentional. And then on August 25th, the case took another dramatic turn. A new witness came forward claiming she had seen something hovering above Vintim Hill on the night Miguel and Manuel died. Her name was Gracinda Souza, and according to her testimony, she had been driving near the hill with several of her children on the evening of August 17th. As they passed the area, they noticed a strange object suspended above the hilltop. She described it as oval-shaped, orange in color, surrounded by what appeared to be a fiery glow. At first, she assumed it might be an aircraft in distress, but then she noticed the object wasn't moving normally. It hovered slightly, rose and descended slowly, and emitted beams of blue light in multiple directions. Gracinda later claimed that she stopped the car and watched the object for several minutes alongside her children. Then eventually, it disappeared. On its own, this sighting might have been dismissed as imagination or misidentification, but once details leaked in the newspapers, multiple additional witnesses came forward describing nearly identical observations from the same evening. Several admitted they initially stayed silent because they feared being ridiculed. But now, newspapers throughout Brazil were openly discussing UFOs, spiritism, secret experiments, and mysterious deaths connected to Vintim Hill. And suddenly, people who remained quiet no longer felt alone. For investigators, this created a nightmare, because now the case had expanded beyond conventional criminal investigation into territory impossible to verify cleanly. Was the UFO sighting connected to the deaths, or were the witnesses unconsciously attaching extraordinary meaning to an already famous mystery? Police had no way to know. But by that point, they could no longer ignore the spiritist angle entirely. Then Manuel's wife revealed something that changed the investigation yet again. According to her, Manuel and Miguel were not merely casual followers of spiritism. They belonged to a secretive group involved in experimental spiritual practices. And shortly before the trip, she had witnessed Manuel arguing with another member of that group, a man investigators already knew very well, Elcio Gomez, the same friend who had driven them to the bus station. Police immediately brought Elcio back for further questioning. The first time investigators spoke with him, he had appeared cooperative and calm, but during the second round of questioning, something changed. Eventually, Elcio confessed that he, Miguel, and Manuel had all participated in a spiritist group focused on experimental communication techniques. And according to him, they were not alone. In fact, he claimed many electronics technicians throughout the region were involved in similar activities. This detail sounds bizarre today, but during the 1950s and 60s, a strange overlap emerged between electronics hobbyists, amateur radio operators, occult researchers, and paranormal enthusiasts across Brazil. Many believed advanced technology might allow them to contact non-human intelligences. Some believed that spirits communicated through electromagnetic frequencies. Others believed that extraterrestrial life forms operated on wavelengths that humans couldn't normally perceive. And some thought the altered states of consciousness combined with electronics could bridge the gap between worlds. According to Elcio, Miguel and Manuel had become obsessed with one particular idea: making contact with beings from Mars. To modern ears, that sounds absurd, but within certain spiritist circles at the time, extraterrestrial life was considered entirely compatible with spiritual doctrine. The reason was simple. If souls exist everywhere, and intelligent life exists elsewhere in the universe, then spiritual entities from other planets should theoretically exist too. And if communication with human spirits was possible, why not contact something beyond Earth entirely? Elcio claimed the group had been conducting increasingly dangerous experiments throughout 1966, using homemade electronic devices, radio equipment, chemical substances, and trance-like states intended to enhance psychic perception. Earlier that year, according to Elcio, the group had built an experimental device designed to facilitate communication with these entities. The machine was tested in Manuel's garden, and according to witnesses, it violently exploded. At first, that sounds like nothing more than faulty electronics, but what happened afterwards convinced Manuel that something extraordinary had occurred. After the explosion, he reportedly discovered a strange powder spread across the ground near his device. To Manuel, this wasn't debris, it was evidence, proof of some kind of contact had taken place. Instead of abandoning the experiments, the group became more committed, more convinced that they were close to a breakthrough, which eventually led to another experiment months later at Atafona Beach. And unlike the garden incident, this one reportedly was witnessed by multiple people. According to Elcio and several local accounts, the group traveled to the beach on June 13, 1966, carrying electronic equipment for another attempt at contact. At some point during the experiment, witnesses allegedly observed an intensely bright object descending over the shoreline. Then came a flash of light so powerful it could reportedly be seen from miles away. Moments later, an explosion erupted, and afterward, investigators would once again hear about a strange powder found near the site. Here's where the case crosses from merely bizarre into almost unbelievable. Because the authorities were already aware that something unusual had occurred at Atafona Beach, not because of UFO sightings, but because the Brazilian Navy had intercepted radio transmission connected to this incident. According to reports, naval monitoring stations detected communications between 3 unregistered radio operators shortly before the explosion occurred. The signals did not match any licensed station in the area, and investigators later suspected that one of those transmissions originated from Miguel and Manuel themselves. The identities of the other operators were never discovered, which introduced yet another mystery. If the experiments involved additional collaborators, who were they? And were they connected to the unidentified men seen dropping Miguel and Manuel off near Vintom Hill shortly before their deaths? At this point, the lead mask case had transformed completely. What began as two unexplained deaths on a hillside now involved secret radio frequencies, occult experimentation, unidentified collaborators, mysterious capsules, handmade protective masks, and multiple UFO reports. And somehow, investigators still had no actual cause of death. Even stranger, the more police learned about Miguel and Manuel, the less they appeared to resemble reckless thrill-seekers or fraud victims. By all accounts, both men genuinely believed they were pursuing some kind of discovery. Not a hoax, not a prank, but something real. Something important enough to lie to their families about. Something important enough to risk their lives for. By late August of 1966, investigators in Rio de Janeiro had managed to piece together a rough outline of what Miguel and Manuel had been doing in the months leading up to their deaths. The picture that emerged was deeply strange. Two electronic technicians had become increasingly involved in scientific spiritism. They had participated in experiments involving homemade electronic devices. Witnesses connected them to unexplained explosions, mysterious lights, and secret radio communications. They had carried handwritten instructions directing them to swallow capsules at specific times while wearing lead masks and waiting for the signal. And now both men were dead on a hillside with no visible injuries and no confirmed cause of death. At this point, police desperately wanted a rational explanation, something concrete, something physical. But the case kept drifting further into territory where science, belief, paranoia, and the paranormal all seemed tangled together. And strangely enough, part of that confusion may have originated from real scientific theories, or at least theories proposed by real scientists. One name that investigators and researchers repeatedly returned to was Sir William Crookes. Crookes was a highly respected British scientist during the late 1800s. Unlike many fringe figures later associated with occult movements, Crookes was legitimate by every conventional standard. He made major contributions to chemistry and physics. He studied radiation, vacuum tubes, spectroscopy. His scientific work helped pave the way for later discoveries involving atomic structure and electronics. And yet, despite his reputation, Crookes also became fascinated with psychic phenomena. Like many intellectuals during the Victorian era, Crookes attended seances and investigated claims involving mediums and spiritual manifestation. Most scientists dismissed these events as outright fraud. Crookes did not, or at least not completely. He believed that some experiences deserved investigation rather than ridicule, and eventually he began considering a radical possibility. What if consciousness itself operated through forms of energy not yet understood by science? Today, that idea sounds like pseudoscience, but in the late 1800s, electricity, radio waves, and radiation were all still being discovered and understood. Entire invisible forces had suddenly become measurable realities. So for some researchers, the idea that human thought might operate similarly didn't feel impossible. Crookes theorized that the brain might contain some undiscovered mechanism capable of transmitting or receiving information beyond the ordinary senses. Not supernatural communication necessarily, more like hidden biological receivers that operate on unknown frequencies. Decades later, ideas like these have heavily influenced spiritist movements throughout South America, especially among technically minded followers. And according to later interviews, many Brazilian spiritists believe that electronics could amplify or focus psychic communication in the same way that radios amplify electromagnetic signals. That belief may explain why so many electronics technicians became involved in these experimental groups. To them, spirituality wasn't separate from science. It was unfinished science. Several weeks after the lead mask case exploded into national news, a Sao Paulo newspaper interviewed a man described only as a professor of yoga who claimed familiarity with local spiritist circles. According to him, Miguel and Manuel were likely attempting telepathic communication through altered states of consciousness. The capsules mentioned in their notes, he suggested, were probably psychedelic substances intended to induce trance states. At the time, substances like LSD and mescaline had begun attracting attention worldwide for their psychological effects. Researchers, mystics, and counterculture groups alike experimented with psychedelics hoping to unlock a hidden aspect of perception. And within spiritist communities, many believed that altered consciousness could make spiritual contact easier. The theory worked like this. Ordinary human awareness acts like a filter. The brain limits perception to maintain stability and function. But under trance states or chemical influence, that filter weakens. Suddenly the mind becomes open to realities normally hidden from conscious perception. To believers, psychedelics didn't create hallucinations, they removed barriers. Several Brazilian researchers later echoed this interpretation of the lead mask case. One scholar argued that the capsules were likely intended to place Miguel and Manuel into a state where they could perceive spiritual light emissions invisible to normal human senses. And according to this theory, the lead mask served a practical purpose, not protection from radiation, but protection from overwhelming light. Remember the witness reports describing an orange object over Vintum Hill emitting beams of blue light. If Miguel and Manuel expected some kind of luminous spiritual manifestation, then suddenly the masks begin making a terrifying kind of sense. Maybe they believed that direct exposure to the phenomenon could blind them or damage them somehow. Maybe they planned to remove the masks only after whatever signal they were waiting for appeared. Still, even if all of this explains why the men went to the hill, it doesn't explain how they died. And that question continued haunting investigators. Because despite all the strange theories surrounding the case, the physical evidence remained frustratingly incomplete. The unidentified men seen in the Jeep were never found, the missing money was never recovered, the source of the capsules remained unknown, and no conclusive toxicology reports were ever produced, which left investigators with several competing possibilities, none of them entirely satisfying. One theory suggests an accidental overdose. Perhaps Miguel and Manuel consumed a powerful hallucinogen supplied by members of the spiritist group. If the dosage was incorrect or if the capsules contained something stronger than expected, the men may have suffered fatal reactions simultaneously. This explanation would account for the lack of external injuries. It would also explain the strange instructions regarding the timing and ingestion. But there were problems with this theory too. Even in the 1960s, fatal overdoses from substances like LSD are extremely rare, and investigators found no sign of violent contusions, vomiting, or panic at the scene. The men appeared strangely peaceful in death. Another theory involved electrocution. After all, previous experiments conducted by the group allegedly involved electronic devices that exploded violently. If Miguel and Manuel had brought some kind of experimental apparatus onto the hill during the rainstorm, an accidental electrocution might explain their sudden deaths. But once again, no equipment was recovered at the scene. And while decomposition complicated the autopsy, investigators found no obvious burns or marks consistent with electrical injury. Then there was the possibility of a deliberate murder, and for many investigators, this remained the most realistic explanation. Because when the strange spiritual details are stripped away, certain facts remain difficult to ignore. Miguel and Manuel lied to their families. They traveled carrying large amounts of cash. They met unidentified individuals shortly before dying. Most of the money vanished, and the instructions found at the scene appeared to come from someone else. Under this interpretation, the lead mask case becomes something much darker. Not a paranormal accident, not a spiritual transcendence, but a manipulation. Imagine two intelligent but deeply credulous men, obsessed with making contact beyond the physical world, men willing to experiment with dangerous substances and secret rituals, men eager to believe they were on the verge of discovering something extraordinary. Those are exactly the kinds of people who can be exploited. Some investigators theorize that the men may have been lured into a fraudulent experiment by members of their own spiritist circle. The capsules could have been poisoned intentionally. The missing money may have been payment for participation. The unidentified men in the Jeep may have supervised the ritual before leaving the victims alone on the hill. and afterward, the perpetrators simply disappeared. But even this explanation feels incomplete, because if the robbery was the motive, why leave part of the money behind? Why create such a bizarre scene? Why the masks? Why the coded instructions? Why involve so many unnecessary complications for what amounted to a relatively small amount of cash? The case almost resists simplification. Every explanation solves one piece while creating two new problems. And then there's a final possibility, the explanation that transformed the lead mask case from an obscure Brazilian mystery into an enduring piece of paranormal history. What if Miguel and Manuel actually succeeded? According to Spiritist teachings, trance states weaken the connection between the body and the soul. In some interpretations, consciousness can temporarily separate from the physical form and enter another plane of existence. Most practitioners viewed this as a temporary spiritual projection. But some texts describe a more dangerous possibility. If the spirit no longer wished to return, the connection would sever permanently. Researchers later pointed to a passage from Allan Kardec's writing describing souls becoming detached from their earthly existence after glimpsing a greater reality. And whether one believes those ideas or not, it's impossible to ignore how closely they parallel the apparent intentions behind the experiment. Miguel and Manuel traveled secretly to an isolated hill. They followed timed instructions, consumed capsules, wore protective masks, and waited for a signal. Not as men preparing for suicide, but as men expecting contact. Then multiple witnesses reported a luminous object floating above the hill the same night. An object unlike any known aircraft. An object emitting strange blue light. And afterward, both men were found dead without injury. For paranormal researchers, the implications were irresistible. Maybe the experiment worked. Maybe the men encountered something beyond ordinary human understanding. And maybe whatever happened on Vintom Hill that night was never meant to be interpreted through conventional criminal investigation at all. Of course, skeptics argue that the entire paranormal framework surrounding the case emerged afterward through media sensationalism and public imagination, and they may be right. Over decades, stories naturally evolve, witnesses influence one another, rumors become facts. The UFO sightings could have been unrelated. The spiritist theories could have been distorted from a far simpler tragedy. But even after removing the supernatural elements entirely, the core of the mystery still remains disturbingly intact. Two men climbed a hill carrying lead masks and cryptic instructions. They swallowed unidentified capsules at a predetermined time, and they died simultaneously without visible injuries. And nearly 60 years later, no one knows why. The lead mask case was officially closed in September of 1966. Authorities concluded that there was insufficient evidence to classify the deaths as homicide. No arrests were ever made, no definitive cause of death was ever established, and eventually public attention drifted elsewhere. But the story never fully disappeared, because some cases remain fascinating precisely because they refuse to fit cleanly into reality. And the lead mask case may be one of the purest examples of that. A mystery balanced somewhere between science and superstition, between fraud and faith, between human deception and something far stranger. Maybe Miguel and Manuel were victims of a scam. Maybe they accidentally poisoned themselves chasing spiritual enlightenment. Maybe they were murdered by people they trusted. Or maybe, on a lonely hill outside Rio de Janeiro, two men truly believed they were about to make contact with something beyond the limits of human understanding, and whatever they encountered there, they never came back from it.